Thoth, Hermes Trismegistus, Hermeticism, and the enduring influence of the Seven Hermetic Principles. The history of Thoth, Hermes Trismegistus, and the tradition later called Hermeticism is not a simple linear religious story. It is the history of cultural fusion, intellectual survival, symbolic adaptation, political secrecy, metaphysical speculation, and psychological technology extending across more than 2,000 years. The tradition emerged from the collision of Egyptian priesthood, Greek philosophy, Hellenistic cosmopolitanism, Roman imperial religion, early Christian theological conflict, Islamic preservation movements, Renaissance occult revival, Enlightenment reaction, 19th century esotericism, 20th century psychology, and modern self-help culture. To understand Hermeticism properly requires tracing not only its doctrines but also the mechanisms by which those doctrines survived, transformed, and embedded themselves in systems of power, spirituality, economics, psychology, advertising, political communication, and modern identity construction. The figure of Thoth originated in ancient Egypt long before the emergence of Greek Hermetic literature. In Egyptian cosmology, Thoth was not merely a god of wisdom in the simplified modern sense. He functioned as a cosmic regulator whose role concerned order, language, measurement, writing, mediation, and divine accounting. Egyptian civilization depended heavily on bureaucratic continuity, astronomical calculation, ritual precision, and record preservation. As a result, the deity associated with writing and calculation became deeply integrated into the maintenance of civilization itself. Thoth was represented as an ibis-headed or baboon-headed figure and was associated with lunar cycles, scribal authority, sacred geometry, and judgment rituals in the afterlife. Faulkner, 1998. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Thoth appears as the recorder during the weighing of the heart ceremony, documenting the deceased's moral balance before Osiris. This role is important because it reveals an early conceptual link between consciousness, morality, language, and cosmic law. Truth was not viewed merely as abstract philosophy. Truth was ontological alignment with Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic order, justice, and balance. Thoth, therefore, became the mediator between divine law and human cognition. This mechanism later became foundational within Hermetic thought itself, the idea that hidden laws govern reality and that knowledge of those laws grants alignment with a higher order. Osman, 2001. When Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt brought Greek influence to the country, especially through the establishment of Alexandria, an unprecedented intellectual fusion ensued. Greek philosophers encountered Egyptian priestly systems that were already ancient by their standards. The Greeks frequently interpreted foreign deities through interpretatio Graeca, mapping local gods onto Greek equivalents. Thoth became associated with Hermes because Hermes also governed writing, communication, mediation, and the transmission of knowledge. Over time, this synthesis produced Hermes Trismegistus, meaning Hermes the Thrice Great. The title likely referred to mastery of the three domains considered supreme in late antiquity: alchemy, astrology, and theurgy, though interpretations vary among scholars. Kapanover, 1992. Hermes Trismegistus was not originally viewed as merely mythical. Many late antique writers treated him as an ancient sage who predated Plato and Moses. This perceived antiquity gave Hermetic texts extraordinary authority because ancient wisdom was considered closer to divine truth than newer doctrines. The intellectual environment of Hellenistic Alexandria is critical to understanding Hermeticism. Alexandria simultaneously contained Egyptian religion, Greek philosophy, Jewish theology, Persian influence, mystery cults, and emerging proto-Christian ideas. Hermeticism developed within this pluralistic environment as a syncretic system attempting to reconcile metaphysics, cosmology, spiritual ascent, and practical knowledge. The resulting Hermetic corpus simultaneously reflected Platonic idealism, Stoic cosmology, Egyptian ritual concepts, and mystical salvation frameworks. The primary classical Hermetic texts are collectively known as the Corpus Hermeticum and the Asclepius. These texts were likely written between the 1st and 4th centuries CE. Fowden, 1993. Contrary to later occult mythology, these were not literal ancient Egyptian temple documents written by a prehistoric super sage. They were Hellenistic philosophical religious texts composed in Greek and later translated into Latin. However, dismissing them as merely fabricated pseudepigrapha misses their deeper significance. Their influence derived not from historical authorship but from their symbolic synthesis of metaphysical systems into a coherent model of consciousness and cosmic participation. A central Hermetic concept is the correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm. Humanity was viewed as a miniature reflection of the cosmos itself. This is where the famous Hermetic phrase "as above, so below" emerges, though its precise wording comes from the later Emerald Tablet tradition rather than directly from the Corpus Hermeticum, Principe, 2013. The mechanism underlying this idea is analogical structure. Hermeticism proposes that patterns repeat across scales of existence. Celestial movements correspond to psychological states, social systems mirror cosmic order, inner transformation reflects universal dynamics. This framework enabled Hermeticism to be adaptable across disciplines by treating symbolic relationships as structurally meaningful rather than metaphorically decorative. The Emerald Tablet, traditionally attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, became especially influential during the medieval and Renaissance periods. Although brief, it condensed Hermetic metaphysics into cryptic formulaic language. Alchemists interpreted it both materially and spiritually. Lead becoming gold represented both chemical experimentation and psychological purification. This duality is essential because Hermeticism rarely entirely separates material and spiritual processes. Transformation is always layered. Economic systems, political systems, personal psychology, ritual systems, and cosmological systems are viewed as reflections of deeper energetic or structural principles. The survival of Hermetic texts through the collapse of the Western Roman Empire depended heavily on Islamic intellectual preservation movements. During the Islamic Golden Age, scholars translated and preserved Greek philosophical and esoteric materials that were often neglected or suppressed in parts of medieval Christian Europe. Hermetic ideas entered Islamic alchemy, astrology, medicine, and philosophy through Arabic translations and reinterpretations. Gudis, 1998. The figure of Hermes was even partially integrated into certain Islamic prophetic genealogies. This preservation became historically decisive during the Renaissance. In the 15th century, the rediscovery and translation of Hermetic texts into Latin by Marsilio Ficino dramatically influenced Renaissance intellectual culture. Ficino believed the Hermetic texts predated Moses and represented primordial divine wisdom. Although later scholarship disproved this chronology, the Renaissance impact had already occurred. Hermeticism became associated with human potential, cosmic harmony, occult science, and the possibility of transcending theological rigidity through hidden wisdom traditions. Renaissance Hermeticism profoundly influenced figures such as Giordano Bruno and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, and it indirectly shaped the intellectual climate surrounding early modern science. The relationship between Hermeticism and science is more complicated than modern narratives usually acknowledge. Early scientists did not sharply divide mystical inquiry from natural philosophy. Alchemy, astronomy, mathematics, theology, and metaphysics frequently overlapped. Isaac Newton devoted enormous effort to alchemical and theological studies alongside physics. Dobbs, 1975. The search for hidden laws governing matter was structurally aligned with Hermetic assumptions about an ordered reality. The famous Seven Hermetic Principles most people know today, however, do not originate directly from classical Hermetic texts. They primarily derive from the Kybalion, published anonymously in 1908 and commonly attributed to William Walker Atkinson and potentially collaborators associated with New Thought movements. This distinction matters historically because modern popular Hermeticism is often a reinterpretation layered atop older Hermetic traditions rather than a pure continuation of classical Hermetic doctrine. The 7 principles outlined in the Kybalion are mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. While these principles simplify and modernize older Hermetic ideas, they have become extraordinarily influential because they translate complex metaphysical systems into psychologically accessible frameworks compatible with modern self-development culture. The principle of mentalism states that the all is mind. Mechanistically, this principle reframes reality as fundamentally shaped by consciousness, perception, interpretation, and symbolic cognition. In ancient Hermeticism, this related to new, or divine intellect permeating reality. In modern applications, the principle evolved into cognitive framing systems, manifestation ideologies, visualization techniques, motivational psychology, branding strategy, and perception management. Modern advertising functions heavily through mentalist assumptions. Corporations do not merely sell products, they construct symbolic realities. Luxury branding, political narrative framing, and influencer culture all depend on controlling perceived meaning structures rather than simply distributing material goods. The principle of correspondence proposes structural similarity across levels of existence. Modern systems theory, organizational modeling, and even fractal mathematics echo analogous reasoning patterns, though scientifically distinct from mystical Hermeticism. Politically and culturally, correspondence thinking appears whenever people interpret macro-level events through micro-level psychology or vice versa. Institutions often recruit through symbolic mirroring mechanisms. National identity mirrors family structure, corporate branding mirrors religious belonging, and ideological movements mirror salvific narratives. The principle of vibration asserts that everything exists in motion and frequency. Scientifically, modern physics does not validate new thought simplifications equating consciousness directly with quantum mechanics. However, vibration language became embedded in social and psychological contexts, including emotional contagion theory, music culture, group dynamics, and wellness movements. Political rallies, religious revivals, concerts, and social media outrage cycles all manipulate emotional synchronization mechanisms resembling what Hermetic traditions symbolically described as vibratory resonance. The principle of polarity states that opposites are identical in nature but different in degree. Heat and cold, love and hate, order and chaos are viewed as spectrums rather than absolute separations. This principle became influential in psychology and persuasion because it reframes conflict as modifiable relational positioning rather than fixed opposition. Modern negotiation theory, dialectical therapy, propaganda framing, and political triangulation frequently employ polarity logic. A population can be shifted incrementally across a spectrum precisely because opposites are treated as psychologically adjacent rather than metaphysically separate. The principle of rhythm suggests that cyclical movement governs systems. Economies rise and fall, political sentiment oscillates, cultural norms fluctuate, and civilizations experience expansion and contraction. Historians from Oswald Spengler to Arnold J. Toynbee propose cyclical theories of civilization structurally similar to Hermetic rhythm concepts, even when not explicitly Hermetic. Financial markets, media cycles, electoral politics, and trend forecasting industries all rely heavily on cyclical modeling assumptions. The principle of cause and effect is perhaps the most enduring, practically influential Hermetic concept. Hermeticism rejected randomness as the ultimate explanation. Everything emerged from chains of causation. Modern behavioral economics, intelligence analysis, psychological operations, marketing analytics, and governance systems all depend on identifying causal leverage points that can produce predictable behavioral outcomes. The difference is that modern systems operationalize these principles empirically rather than mystically. Nevertheless, the structural logic remains comparable. The principle of gender, in Hermetic terms, referred less to biological sex than to generative duality, active and receptive principles existing throughout reality. Modern reinterpretations often distort this concept into simplistic masculine/feminine essentialism. Historically, however, Hermetic traditions treated gender symbolically as a creative polarity necessary for the processes of manifestation. Alchemical symbolism relied heavily on union imagery because transformation was conceptualized as the reconciliation of divided forces. The influence of Hermeticism on modern occult traditions is immense. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn integrated Hermetic principles into ceremonial magic systems that later influenced Aleister Crowley, Wicca, modern ritual magic, and Western esotericism more broadly. Carl Jung also engaged deeply with alchemical symbolism and Hermetic imagery. Jung interpreted alchemy psychologically rather than literally, arguing that alchemical transformation symbolized the processes of individuation within the unconscious mind. Jung, 1968. This reinterpretation helped transfer Hermetic ideas into modern psychotherapy, archetypal analysis, and self-development frameworks. By the 20th and 21st centuries, Hermetic principles migrated beyond occult subcultures into mainstream motivational and entrepreneurial culture. Mindset, energy, manifestation, alignment, frequency, and attraction language became widespread within coaching industries, social media branding, wellness culture, and influencer economies. Often, users of these frameworks do not recognize their intellectual genealogy. Yet structurally, they inherit modified Hermetic assumptions: consciousness shapes experience, symbolic alignment matters, internal states influence external outcomes, and hidden patterns govern visible reality. Political communication also extensively employs quasi-Hermetic mechanisms. Modern mass persuasion depends on symbolic correspondence, emotional resonance, narrative framing, and controlled repetition. Public relations theorists like Edward Bernays understood that populations respond less to isolated facts than to integrated symbolic environments. Hermeticism historically emphasized that symbols influence consciousness through associative structures. Modern propaganda systems operationalize similar principles technologically through media saturation and algorithmic amplification. Even financial markets reveal quasi-hermetic dimensions in practice. Markets are not purely rational computational systems. They are emotional symbolic ecosystems driven by confidence, narrative contagion, expectation cycles, and perception management. Investor sentiment often matters as much as material fundamentals in short-term valuation behavior. Thus, modern economics repeatedly encounters phenomena where psychological reality materially shapes external outcomes, echoing modified forms of mentalist reasoning. However, serious historical analysis requires distinguishing legitimate intellectual history from exaggerated conspiracy mythology. Hermeticism influenced elite intellectual traditions, secret societies, and symbolic systems, but claims that all world events are consciously orchestrated through ancient Hermetic doctrine, collapses into reductionism. Influence does not equal omnipotent coordination. Cultural systems evolve more often through layered adaptation, institutional incentives, emergent behavior, and decentralized imitation than through singular centralized control. At the same time, dismissing Hermetic influence entirely would also be historically inaccurate. The persistence of Hermetic frameworks across religions, occult systems, psychology, marketing, leadership training, entertainment symbolism, and digital culture demonstrates extraordinary mimetic durability. The principles survive because they address recurring human concerns, the desire for hidden order, the relationship between mind and reality, the search for empowerment, and the hope that chaos can be understood through pattern recognition. The enduring power of Hermeticism lies less in literal supernatural proof than in its adaptability as a symbolic operating system. It offers a language for interpreting complexity. During periods of uncertainty, fragmentation, institutional distrust, or rapid technological change, systems promising hidden coherence become especially attractive. Hermeticism repeatedly resurfaces during transitional historical eras precisely because it frames instability as patterned rather than meaningless. Today, Hermetic principles continue to operate simultaneously as a spiritual philosophy, a psychological metaphor, a branding architecture, a political persuasion strategy, and a self-development methodology. Whether in elite symbolism, motivational seminars, mindfulness culture, algorithmic influence campaigns, or digital identity construction, the underlying assumption persists that consciousness, symbols, patterns, and perception interact in powerful ways, shaping human behavior and collective reality. The historical journey from Thoth and ancient Egyptian temple culture to modern manifestation influencers on social media is therefore not accidental. It represents the continuous adaptation of ancient symbolic frameworks into new institutional and technological environments. The names changed, the cosmologies evolved, and the mechanisms became secularized, but the underlying pursuit remained remarkably consistent, understanding the hidden structures believed to govern reality and learning how alignment with those structures might produce power, transformation, knowledge, or transcendence. References: Osman, J. 2001. The Search for God in Ancient Egypt. Cornell University Press. Koppenhover, B. P. 1992. Hermetica, the Greek Corpus Hermeticum and the Latin Asclepius in a New English translation with notes and introduction. Cambridge University Press. Dobbs, B. J. T. 1975. The Foundations of Newton's Alchemy. Cambridge University Press. Faulkner, R. O. 1998. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, The Book of Going Forth by Day. Chronicle Books. Fowden, G. 1993. The Egyptian Hermes, A Historical Approach to the Late Pagan Mind. Princeton University Press. Gudis, D. 1998. Greek Thought, Arabic Culture, The Greco-Arabic Translation Movement in Baghdad and Early Abbasid Society. Routledge. Young, C. G. 1968. Psychology and Alchemy, 2nd ed. Princeton University Press. Principe, L. M. 2013. The Secrets of Alchemy. University of Chicago Press.